I moved to a secluded ranch in the desert, seeking peace and solitude. But what I found lurking in the shadows that night was something I could never explain. A voice calling for help. A creature watching from the darkness. Something unnatural. What happened next would change everything I thought I knew about the desert and my own safety. This is the terrifying story of my encounter with a creature that wasn't human. But before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll never miss a spine-tingling episode. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, comment, and share the video. And if you want even more, stay connected with us on our social media platforms for more creepy content. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. And now let's dive into the darkness together. It all started when I moved to a secluded ranch in southern Arizona. I was craving some peace and solitude, far from the noise and crowds of the city. My house was on the edge of a small town, nestled near a reservation where people spoke very little about their traditions. I'd heard vague warnings from a few locals, usually in a joking tone, about strange things in the desert. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just superstition. That was until I experienced something that changed my mind completely. At first it was just minor inconveniences, missing livestock, my dogs barking into the night at nothing, and odd tracks that didn't seem to belong to any animal I knew. These tracks were too large, and something about them didn't feel right. They were clearly from a creature walking on two legs, but at times the prints seemed to have paws at the end. I thought maybe a mountain lion or some wild animal was getting too close, but it was strange. One evening, after a long day of work, I was sitting on the porch when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A woman's voice, distant and desperate. It sounded like she was calling for help. At first, I thought it might be someone from the nearby town, but the voice didn't quite fit. It was too faint, too distorted, as though it were traveling from a great distance. I stood up and walked towards the sound, trying to make sense of it. The voice came from beyond the tree line near the far corner of my property. "Please, help me. It's cold." The words were faint, but I could tell they were coming closer. I should have stayed inside, but I've always believed in helping those in need. So I grabbed my flashlight and walked in the direction of the voice. But when I reached the edge of the woods, everything went silent. For a long moment, there was no sound at all, until the voice came again. This time, it was far too close. It was no longer pleading. It had turned into something else, something primal and angry. "Get away from here," it hissed. "You should not be out here." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. A chill ran down my spine, and the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. I didn't know why, but every fiber of my being told me to turn back. But before I could, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of a small clearing, just out of the reach of my flashlight's beam. I thought it might be a person at first, but the shape was all wrong. Too tall, too hunched, like a shadow that didn't quite belong. It moved in a way that no human could. Its arms hung too low, and it slithered rather than walked. And then I saw its eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were red, glowing faintly in the dark. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as though the creature was somehow controlling me, locking me in place with just its presence. It took a step forward, and I could see its face. At first, it looked almost human, but distorted, like the face of an old friend. Then it shifted, twisting into something much darker. Something that made no sense at all. One moment it resembled the features of an animal. The next, it was a grotesque mix of both. And then it spoke again. Its voice was a low, cruel laugh. "You're far from where you belong," it said, mocking me. I snapped out of my stupor and bolted. I don't remember running, but I must have, because when I looked back, the creature was gone, vanished into the night. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I didn't pack my things or even think twice. I left the ranch without hesitation, leaving everything behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, that the desert was not as empty as it seemed. Later, I learned a bit about local legends, the stories of creatures called Yi Naldlushi, or Skinwalkers. They are said to be shapeshifters, capable of assuming the form of anything or anyone, and using their voices to deceive. It's said that once they have you, they take you into the wilderness, and you never return. I don't know if what I encountered that night was truly one of them, but I do know that I'll never go back to that place. Some things are better left unexplored. Nina's fever had been unyielding all day, her small face flushed with heat, and her body radiated warmth through the thin blanket. It kept me restless. I'd been caring for her during this illness for almost a week, and tonight I could feel that something was different, like we were at a breaking point. Every breath she took was shallow and strained, as if her lungs couldn't keep up with the demands. I sat by her bed, one hand resting on her feverish forehead, the other holding my phone. The alarm was set for 3 a.m. for her next dose of medicine. The minutes crawled by, the ticking of the clock echoing in the stillness of our small apartment. Sleep eluded me. Each creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of a car engine, made my heart race. When the alarm finally blared, I jumped, nearly dropping the phone. I slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb Nina's soft murmurs. She needed the medicine, so I padded into the kitchen, my eyes squinting in the harsh light of the overhead bulb as I searched the cabinet for the Tylenol. That's when I noticed it. A strange, stark white light cutting through the curtains. It wasn't the warm glow of a streetlight or the flickering of a distant TV. It was cold and unnaturally bright, slicing through the darkness, casting long, angular shadows across the living room. I froze, gripping the bottle of medicine, unsure of what I was seeing. Something was off. I crept toward the sliding glass door, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. A car sat at the far end of the parking lot, its headlights piercing the trees beyond. The car was still, the engine off, its lights locked on the woods like it was searching for something. I assumed maybe someone had pulled in and was just sitting there, but it didn't move. And then, I saw it. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the headlights. My eyes strained to make sense of the movement. Was it a shadow? No. It was something low to the ground, moving between the trees. A fox, I thought. It was a common sight around here. But this thing moved strangely, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like they weren't working together. I leaned in closer, pressing my forehead to the cool glass, trying to make sense of it as it stepped into the light. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a fox. At least not anymore. The creature's form rippled, shifting in and out, like something trying to remember what it was supposed to be. First, it was dog-like, its tail twitching nervously. Then, it stretched and grew, becoming cat-like. But that too changed. It shifted again, and suddenly it resembled a bear, dragging itself across the forest floor with a heavy, lumbering gait. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced. Was this an optical illusion? A trick of the headlights or the shadows? But the way it moved, unnatural, wrong. There was no explaining it. Trembling, I edged closer to the window again, driven by fear and disbelief. The creature had changed again, now a small, rounded shape with fur that shimmered unnaturally under the headlights. A raccoon? But even that didn't seem right. It was too fluid, its form constantly warping, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the sounds around me. I needed to wake Luke. I needed him to see this. He would help me make sense of it. But before I could move, the creature froze, its body shifting as if it were turning to face me. Despite not having any visible features, I felt its gaze. It was as if it could see straight through me, straight to my soul. Before I knew it, I was halfway down the hall, shaking Luke awake. "Luke, wake up!" I hissed, shaking his shoulder. "You have to see this." He groaned, confused, but I didn't have time for his protests. I grabbed his arm and pulled him into the living room. My words tumbled out in a rush, frantic, but I could barely get them out. "The headlights, the creature, outside." We reached the door, and I pulled back the curtain. The light outside was brighter, sharper than before, and it made my stomach twist in fear. I didn't want to look, but I had to. When I did, I saw the creature again. It was closer now, crawling out of the woods. Its form had shifted once more, shrinking into a small striped shape. A skunk. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was just a skunk. All that panic for nothing. I turned to Luke with a shaky laugh. "It's just a skunk." But Luke didn't respond. He was staring at the creature, his face pale. I followed his gaze and turned back to the glass. No, it wasn't a skunk anymore. The creature's fur rippled, its body spasming as it shifted once again. The skunk's form grew larger, then smaller, then larger again, until it looked almost human, its arms long, its body twisted at strange angles. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing seemed to collapse in on itself, only to reform over and over, its shape shifting unnaturally. Luke stood frozen beside me, his eyes wide with disbelief. His usual strength, the confidence that I'd relied on, had completely disappeared. I clutched his arm, trembling, unable to tear my gaze away. The creature's movements were jerky, wrong. It paused under the headlights, shuddering as if preparing for something. Finally, Luke spoke, his voice strained. "We need to call animal control." I shook my head, my words coming out harsher than I intended. "That's not an animal." My throat was dry, and I struggled to say more. "It's not normal. You saw it. It's not an animal." Luke hesitated, his fingers hovering over his phone. "What else could it be?" he asked, but his voice wavered. He didn't know, just like I didn't. We both understood that it wasn't something we could explain. Before I could say anything else, the car's headlights flickered, dimming briefly before surging brighter than before. The creature froze mid-crawl, its head jerking to the side like it was listening for something. Then, in an instant, the headlights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the parking lot. "Turn on the porch light," I urged, gripping Luke's arm. He fumbled for the switch, and the weak light above the sliding door flickered to life, casting an eerie glow on the deck. The creature was gone, but the wet smear on the glass remained. Its grotesque, lingering mark a reminder that it had been there. Luke exhaled sharply, slumping against the wall. "It's gone," he murmured. But I didn't believe it. I couldn't. The thing that had moved so unnaturally, that had stared at us with no eyes, it wasn't just going to disappear. It was still out there, waiting. "I'm going out there," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. Luke's head snapped to me. "No, you're not." "I need to see," I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. "I need to know it's gone." He grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "You're not stepping outside. You just saw that thing. You're not going out there." But I couldn't sit still. I couldn't wait for it to come back. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter before Luke could stop me, sliding the door open just enough to step outside. The cold hit me like a slap. The air felt wrong, silent, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I shone the flashlight across the gravel lot, scanning for any sign of the creature. The car was still there, but everything else was empty. The spot where the thing had crawled was disturbed, as though something heavy had dragged itself through the gravel. Then, just as I reached the edge of the deck, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A wet, dragging sound. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering. I thought I saw something move in the shadows, low to the ground, just out of reach of the light. My heart raced, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the doorframe. I slammed the sliding door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. "What did you see?" Luke asked urgently. "Nothing," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's gone." But I didn't believe it. Not for a second. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. as I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Luke had fallen asleep, his steady breathing a painful reminder of how he could compartmentalize, while I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. It wasn't gone. I could feel it, the oppressive weight in the air. And then, through the curtains, I saw it again, a faint glow, pulsing like a dying firefly. I froze. The creature hadn't left. It was back. We arrived at our campsite near a small town in Idaho just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. The surrounding forest was calm and dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels. My boyfriend Luke and I were excited for the weekend, a chance to disconnect, explore, and maybe even experience a little thrill with some ghost hunting. He had mentioned an old cemetery nearby, and we thought it might be interesting to visit the next day. At first, the campsite seemed perfect, peaceful, secluded, surrounded by towering trees swaying gently in the breeze. We set up our tent, started a fire, and began to relax. I played some music from my phone while Luke roasted marshmallows, telling me stories about Idaho City's rich history. But as he spoke, something felt off. The crackling of the fire seemed to grow louder, almost drowning out his voice. I tried to ignore it, but an uneasy feeling began to settle in my stomach. After a while, I glanced at my phone and saw that the battery was at 30%. A few minutes later, it died without warning. I stared at the screen in confusion. There was no way it should have drained that fast. "We should go sit in the car and charge it for a bit," I suggested. Luke agreed, saying he would check on the fire while I stayed inside. As I settled into the car, trying to relax, I heard the passenger door slam shut with such force that the whole car shook. My heart raced as I whipped around. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trees, their shadows shifting eerily in the glow. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Luke returned moments later and, just as I expected, dismissed it. "Probably just the wind," he said. But I could tell he was rattled too. We decided to turn in for the night. The wind had picked up, sending strange, whispering sounds through the trees as it rattled the tent. Once inside, we crawled into our sleeping bags, but sleep was elusive. The noise outside, the wind brushing against the tent, sounded almost intentional, like something was moving just outside, watching us. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just nature playing tricks, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The faint whispers I heard carried on the wind only added to the sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was waiting just beyond the trees, aware of us. Sometime in the early morning, I woke to Luke shaking my shoulder. His face was pale in the dim light. "Listen," he whispered, barely audible. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over the dry leaves just outside our tent. My heart skipped a beat. The footsteps circled us, moving around the tent, getting closer. I could feel Luke tense beside me. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for me to stay quiet. The steps came nearer, heavy and slow, like someone was taking their time, deliberately moving around us. My breath hitched. Who could it be? We hadn't seen anyone for miles. A faint metallic sound scraped against the car. Definitely not an animal. It was deliberate. I grabbed for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but the battery was still dead. Panic surged as I realized we were stuck without a way to see or communicate. Luke nodded toward the car, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. We needed to scare whatever it was away. I fumbled with the car keys, my hand trembling, and pressed the button to activate the alarm. The forest exploded in noise as the car horn blared, the lights flashing. The footsteps stopped immediately. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. We waited, holding our breath. The alarm stopped, and the stillness returned. The wind whispered through the trees, but the footsteps were gone. "Maybe it's gone," Luke murmured, offering me a shaky smile. But something told me it wasn't over. Minutes passed, and just when I started to relax, the footsteps returned. This time, they were even closer, moving around the tent again, circling us. The fear in Luke's eyes was unmistakable. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps moved slowly, coming right up to where we lay. Then a whisper, soft, carried on the wind. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was right outside. Luke squeezed my hand, his grip tight with fear. We needed to leave. We started packing quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every sound felt amplified. Every movement seemed to echo in the dark. My hands shook uncontrollably as I struggled to zip up my bag. Finally, we were ready. Luke unzipped the tent, the sound grating against the silence. The air felt heavy, thick, as if something was pressing in around us. A sour smell hit me, making me gag. We stepped outside into the cold night. The trees loomed overhead, their shadows stretching toward us. I grabbed our bags and ran for the car, my heart pounding in my chest. Luke followed behind, grabbing the rest of our gear. Suddenly, I heard a voice call my full name. Emma! It was urgent, desperate, but something felt off. We never used our full names, always nicknames. My blood ran cold. I froze in place, staring into the dark. The voice called again, more insistent this time. Then Luke appeared beside me. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice trembling. I turned to him, my heart racing. "Did you call me?" I asked, but he shook his head. He hadn't called me. We didn't waste any more time. We threw everything into the car and sped off, tires kicking up gravel as we raced down the winding road. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, its twisted branches reaching out like dark hands. We hadn't been driving long when a deer suddenly leaped onto the road, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. Luke slammed on the brakes, just narrowly avoiding it. The deer stood still, unblinking, its matted fur hanging in patches. Something about it was wrong. Its eyes didn't look natural. "Go around it," I whispered, my voice shaky. Luke nodded, cautiously steering around the deer. As we passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that its gaze was locked on me, its glowing eyes piercing into my soul. We kept driving, trying to distance ourselves from the campsite. But each time we rounded a bend, there it was again, the same deer, standing in the road, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Luke swerved to avoid it, but I could feel my panic rising. How could it be the same deer? We had just passed it. It kept happening, over and over, each time more twisted, more wrong. Its body seemed to fall apart, its eyes glowing brighter with each encounter. "Don't stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just keep going." Luke's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, and we drove faster. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees pressing in from every side. Finally, we saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Relief washed over me as we pulled into the town. The feeling of being watched slowly began to fade, but the fear lingered in the back of my mind. We made it home without speaking much. Neither of us had the words. But as I stepped inside our house, the sense of dread returned. The air felt cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker. Whatever we encountered in those woods wasn't done with us. It had followed us, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found us again. If you've experienced a terrifying event or have a horror story to tell, we at AG Horrors want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us on Reddit, and let's uncover the mysteries hiding in the shadows together. And if you want to support the channel and help us bring even more terrifying content, consider checking out our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support means the world to us. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories like this one. And now, stay tuned for the next horror episode.